Hello guys, how's it going? My name is Dale, and by the time you're watching this video, yesterday, the Beta Realms have finally gone online for the week with a brand new build. Probably one of the biggest builds when it comes to class tuning, where we saw a ton of different class specs, hero towns, and so many different playstyles receive buffs after buffs after buffs, with plenty of classes receiving a variety of different changes and so many new improvements, from every single tank spec in the game receiving some damage amps, to Death Knights receiving more buffs, warlocks, mages, warriors, and even the class of rogue, with rogues feeling kind of like another abandoned class over the last few weeks. But now with this new set of buffs, the class may actually just be back. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, so of course I had to jump on and test out all of these newest changes, especially for the class that I've been maining for the last few expansions, to see if they could still be salvaged for this upcoming expansion. As always, if you guys want to see more regular class discussions like these for the War Within, be sure to follow the channel and subscribe. Otherwise, let's dive right in. So, rogues are actually getting an update. Let's take a look at everything we got so far. Is it going to be enough to save rogues? And I really do want to have you keep that thought in mind, keep that question in mind. Is this going to be enough to save rogues? Because the class has definitely been fairly underwhelming so far throughout multiple months over in the beta. I mean, personally, I've been playing every other class besides a rogue, but I guess the question is there still hope? And I know there's a lot of rogues that have been very dissatisfied with the progression in the beta, but all these damage buffs, could these be enough to at least keep the class not overpowered, but like viable is the bare minimum we're looking for. So starting things off, we got some generic things such as Fatebound. This is available for both oh, they actually adjusted the UI for this. It's no longer like cut off at the top of the screen, it's like centered. That is unusual. That is a quality right here, quality update, right? Before we even get into the towers, they moved the windows, it's no longer like super high up. I like this in general. So the Fatebound, which is a spec, or a hero spec, available to both Assassination and Outlaw, a very passive, kind of a bland, kind of a boring playstyle that doesn't necessarily interact with your rotation in your major ways. It's gotten improved. So the main mechanic of this one is Hand of Fate, which is basically where some people have an issue with this one to begin with, is the main ability. Every time you spend 5 common points or more into a finisher, you flip a coin. Either the coin lands on a tails, which does quite a bit of cosmic damage to the target. Here it's like quite a bit actually, and it can crit, and it counts as a finisher too. So for Outlaw, if you want to Blade Flurry with it, at least in previous builds it would count as a finisher. When you get a tails, it does cosmic damage, and it gives you a stack that increases the damage of that tails. So when you use the finisher again, and if it tails again, it'll increase the damage of that tails. But basically it's a 50-50 every time you flip a coin, whether it's heads or tails. Tails is cosmic damage and a damage amp. Heads is a 10% damage amp for all of your abilities, which is quite significant. And every time you stack it, it's 2% extra every single time. The actual coin itself, the heads itself, got buffed up, so it is 10% from previous builds. And then as you saw, as we get more stacks of heads, it gives plus 2% additional overall damage every time you roll a heads. So that's huge. The tails also itself has been amplified by quite a bit. The baseline tails damage increased by 50%. It's actually a significant amount of your overall damage. I mean, this thing does more damage than some of your other finishers. So it's just a borrowed power type of mechanic. And it's just a passive thing that you don't necessarily have to think about, but they made it do a ton more significant damage. Now, with it being a flip of a coin, heads or tails, you will roughly spend, unless you're dead, you'll spend a good portion of the encounter, either about 50% in the tails department, 50% in the heads. So about half the dungeon you're going to be getting either the cosmic damage or a raw damage increase for your rogue. The damage increases are significant, and they really do amplify it. Lucky Coin is another one, which is part of your capstone option. So if you roll a tails 7 times in a row or a heads 7 times in a row, you get a buff called Lucky Coin. You get a buff that increases your agility by 7%. However, if you already achieved the Lucky Coin 7% buff and you end up flipping a coin heads 7 times or tails 7 times again, the coin then just does cosmic damage. That cosmic damage has been increased by 70%, which is a nice gain, but nothing super crazy. It is going to be a smaller portion of your overall damage, but hey, free damage is free damage. Besides this, we also got a couple of adjustments such as Delivered Doom. When dealing damage with a Fatebound coin and it flips a tail, which is causing damage, that damage is increased by 30% if there's no other enemies that are near your primary target. So on boss fights, the tail is even more effective at pure single target damage. Then we have the Fate Intertwined ability, where Fate Intertwined duplicates 30% of your Dispatch or Envenom, since this is available for both specs. If that Envenom or Dispatch critical strikes, 30% of it is duplicated to 2 additional enemies. However, if there's nothing else for you to duplicate to, it just smacks the boss for 30% additional damage instead. This one increased from 20% to 30%, which is another gain for both Assassination and Outlaw, and gives Assassination a bit more of like a cleave-esque profile, where you still want to maintain your dots, but using Envenom causes it to cleave to things nearby, so you can have more of like this focused funnel type of damage, which is kind of good. Overall though, the Fatebound damage numbers, at least in the early numbers based on Rogue community info, it is solid. The damage gains for Fatebound, whether giving you the heads coin for additional raw damage, or now the tails with additional single target damage, makes this actually a very competitive choice for Assassination. So Assass actually has options between 2 hero specs that at least numerically are pretty close. For Outlaw, that's also a massive gain in that department, and I feel like it probably is going to be a playstyle that many players are going to end up going into, mostly because of there's issues with Trickster. But even Trickster got some buffs. The main ability for Unseen Blade for Trickster saw a 78% damage increase, which should probably tell you just how far behind Trickster was as a hero spec. The rest of your actual kit doesn't change too much, though there is still an issue with Trickster, primarily with the ability of coup de grace. The capstone ability is supposed to be the exciting part of the Trickster playstyle, where you, instead of eviscerating or dispatching at the target, the rogue instead charges at them using this little animation that does look kind of cool, but the charge is super unusual to use, because when rogues use dispatch or eviscerate, you don't think of it as a charge style ability, so the ability force charging into the boss just feels super awkward. But also, the actual animation lock does lock you out of using other abilities. So as a sub-rogue, instead of Shadow Dance, you're trying to Shadow Strike and eviscerate as much as possible, and that animation lock just feels super jarring and uncomfortable, and kind of prevents you from actually being able to go through a proper rotation. It isn't a great implementation, although I see what they were trying to do with it. What I would suggest still is transfer coup de grace to replace your killing spree, or replace your secret technique as a sub-rogue, and then you at least can delay and use coup de grace when you need to, because rogues used to play back in the day with DFA back in Legion, which has an animation lock to it. It's a cool animation, but it does create an animation lock type of environment. Although when we had Death from Above, it didn't replace Eviscerate, it was a separate ability, and then you could delay it when you needed to use Death from Above, and then save it during crucial moments, and you could play around that. Because coup de grace replaces your eviscerate or dispatch, it kind of eats into your rotation, and for Outrogue, those vanish crackshot windows have an animation lock eat into your rotation, doesn't feel good, and results in a damage loss. Subtlety, having that animation eat up into your rotation of your Shadow Dance symbols of death window, it eats up into your rotation, which isn't great, doesn't feel good, but it also results in a damage loss. Aside of this, Assassination rogues have gotten buffed up yet again. Last week we saw a pretty sizable increase to Assassination all across the board for the basic combat abilities, the auto attacks, and their basic finishers, and we're seeing another one of these again. All abilities buffed up by 10%. All ability damage, everything increased by 10%, but also your auto attack damage increased by 10%. So it's roughly as close to a raw 10% additional buff to Assassination, plus whatever buff they had previously, which was also a raw additional buff as well. So this is 2 sets of buffs for 2 weeks in a row, putting an Assassination in a much more competitive spot. Besides this, you also did see adjustments for Crimson Tempest. They're buffing that by 8% to make sure that it is still usable. And with Venomous Wounds, you get a little bit more energy restoration, 8 energy instead of 7 energy per tick of your dots. Nothing crazy. It is kind of sort of noticeable, but nothing super incredible or anything. Overall, the Assassination, I feel like previous build played okay, but just was a little undertuned. But this time around, it kind of gets the best of both worlds. It got a little bit of a damage buff, where your damage does feel like it has a bit more of an impact. Your cooldowns feel a little bit better to use all in all together. And I think with the buffs to Fatebound, you are creating a situation where Assassination could potentially have a couple of decent, solid options of hero specs. There are still some issues and plenty of bugs to consider when it comes to Assass, Fatebound, and Deathstalker overall though. However, it is a lot more playable, it is a lot more testable, it is a lot more manageable, and you can kind of get a better picture of how Assassination plays after all of these changes. It is a buff that is very much appreciated either way though. For the spec of Outlaw, we've seen a very similar thing. Just like Assassination last week, they saw quite a few damage buffs here and there, roughly, I think numerically it was about maybe 16% at the highest worth of gains, and this week it's another 18%. So you look at it like over this is just rough napkin math here, but maybe like closer to 30% damage buff since a couple of weeks ago, which is kind of wild. The spec was quite a bit behind though, and it still has issues of their own, but at the very least we are looking a little bit better and we feel a little bit better to play. So for Outlaw, we saw a ability damage increase again like last week, and auto attack damage increase again like last week. Killing Spree as an ability also saw an 8% damage jump, and that is actually quite noticeable, the Killing Spree change. It is an ability that is still a little bit weird to use because it can sometimes put you in weird spots. There is a little bit of a defensive component with Killing Spree, like how it allows you to stagger the damage that you take during a Killing Spree, so that is kind of nice at the very least, but I still would love to see some kind of like a damage reduction effect to it, just so you can more safely use Killing Spree. I don't think they're going to completely rework Killing Spree and remove its animation aspect to it, but if they can at least make it a lot safer to use, then I'll be very, very happy. But in raids, I feel like that's where rogues are going to get caught out using Killing Spree a couple of times. And even in dungeons, like if it puts you in front of a boss's frontal or accidentally puts you in like a one-shot mechanic, not having the control over abilities like that does not feel good at all. Now, another thing that got buffed up is also a bit more energy regen for Outlaw, with combat potency going up from 25% to 30%. You don't really feel it. It's a nice change, but you don't necessarily feel it. I guess Outlaw being a little bit more haste heavy, you are going a bit more energy generation focused, since you have to have the haste necessary in order to meet the adrenaline rush cooldown reduction mechanic. So yeah, it's nice, but I don't think you're gonna notice it. But I wonder if that'll have more of an impact like long term. There was, however, a pretty sizable change with Ace Up Your Sleeve reverted. So this was a nerf initially implemented roughly 2 months ago, that every time you got a reset on you between the eyes, which happens a lot inside of those crack shot windows, you vanish, spam between the eyes as you prime finisher, and there's chances, pretty high chance that every time you use that ability, it just refunds the combo points it just spent. So last time we looked at it, it refunded 4 combo points. This time it's refunding full 5 combo points like the original version of this ability. Now, the refund on combo points doesn't really make that much of a difference. Technically, as combo points goes, it does include additional damage for you between the eyes, but where for Outlaw this whole combo point shenanigans was concerning though, is the cooldown reduction aspect of the spec. And this change in particular, while it seems like, oh, this seems like a really nothing kind of a change, this is actually a huge change. You see, this is because Outlaw Rogue is very much a cooldown reduction spec with Restless Blades. Finisher moves reduce the remaining cooldown of many of your rogue skills by 1 second per combo point spent. Things like Adrenaline Rush, Between the Eyes, Blade Flurry, Blade Rush, Ghosted Strike, Grappling Hook, Keep It Rolling, Killing Spree, Roll the Bones, Sprint, and Vanish. All of these abilities have a bit more cooldown reduction for every combo point that you spend in all of these abilities. Also, whenever we roll the bones for one of our buffs is called True Bearing, which essentially enhances that cooldown reduction mechanic a little bit further with an additional half a second, I believe, if not a full second. Actually, I can find it right here. Yeah, so it was half a second. So finisher moves basically become even more effective at reducing the cooldown of all of your abilities. Therefore, every combo point you spend into a finisher counts. So with the Between the Eyes mechanic of Crackshot and Ace Up Your Sleeve, essentially every time we'd refund combo points, we would immediately follow up with another Between the Eyes and spam as many of these out as we can. With them initially reducing the combo points you gained, it essentially slowed down the spec. Less cooldown reduction, less way for you to regain Blade Flurry, Killing Spree, Adrenaline Rush, your Vanish Windows, your Between the Eyes ability, all of those things. So with them, reverting it back with an extra combo point is actually huge because it increases the pace of the spec. It's one of those background changes that actually makes the spec feel really exceptionally good to play. Another advantage of this is actually it makes the Keep It Rolling builds a little bit better if you don't want to play Hidden Opportunity and play around ambushes as an Outlaw Rogue at all, which is still quite effective and add more consistency because I don't think there's enough to make Keep It Rolling a consistent enough playstyle yet, although they could easily fix it if they were to just add the current tier set that we have in Dragonflight as a talent in War Within. Then I think keep patrolling would be much more feasible. That being said, it's a lot of little background changes, but over the last few weeks we've seen Outlaw grow quite a bit in terms of damage, so right now numerically the spec might actually feel kind of okay. As for the spec of Subtlety, we are seeing just a slight reduction of Secret Technique being nerfed by 6%. Nothing crazy. No, not a big deal. As Subtlety rogues that were already playing around with Trickster, so the Unseen Blade buff for them in particular is really good. With Unseen Blade being buffed and the nerf to Secret Technique, it just simply makes Trickster even better and just kind of makes up for any of the nerfs that we saw with Secret Technique. I think if anything it probably doesn't help Deathstalker nearly as much, but yeah, it's just a very slight adjustment. But Subtlety already was one of the more comparable specs when it comes to raid testing at the very least, and it looks like Subtlety still has a room at the table when it comes to big, large forms of group content such as raiding content. But with everything we see here, we do see the class of rogue performing a little bit better when it comes to their overall damage. Specs like Assassination already felt pretty good, but they were just lacking the damage output to be in a more competitive spot. So that spec in particular is seeing probably the most amount of resurgence over in the beta. Outlaw Rogue has been quite behind in terms of its overall damage, and it still has some core issues, though they are rolling back some of the initial nerfs that made the spec feel more sluggish, like that Ace Up Your Sleeve change. Would have still loved to see things like our current tier set in Dragonflight, which was a game changer for so many rogues. Would have loved to see that thing implemented as a talent, and that would have been an easy dub for Blizz if they did that, but hopefully in the future update maybe they'll consider adding something like that as part of our overall kit, because it makes the whole Roll the Bones playstyle and the randomness of buffs a lot easier for veteran players, but also, and more importantly, newer players to pick up the spec and start doing well with it instead of having to deal with the minutiae of the buffs and the management of it all. While Fatebound is a very boring hero spec option for rogues, it is now a little bit more effective. And at the very least, I feel like if you are going to have a very passive playstyle, it might as well be an effective one that does enough damage. And the current version of it definitely does feel like a massive upgrade than what it was before. Then we also have Trickster, which has been buffed, but still has those issues like the coup de grace animation lock, which is not favored by anybody in the rogue community. So that is something that I hope does get worked out at some point in the future. If you are looking forward to potentially playing a rogue in War Within, I would still approach with a little bit of caution. What I would do, at least when it comes to the first leveling week of the expansion, is I would at the very least consider leveling a rogue and then immediately leveling a second character afterwards, because you never really know. If rogues get enough attention over these next few crucial weeks before the release of War Within, then potentially it would be a class that is in a fantastic spot as a considerable main going forward. But in their current state as we speak, I would still be a little bit cautiously optimistic to say the very least. However, we are seeing a lot of the end of the tunnel, and this new set of changes has been a massive improvement. But with that being said, I do want to thank you guys so much for watching this video, and I hope all of you enjoyed. If you did enjoy it or found it informative, go ahead and give it a like. I would very much appreciate it. And also share in the comments down below, what do you think about the class of Rogue for the expansion of War Within? Are you potentially going to be maining this class, or are you still a little bit cautiously optimistic, like not quite sure, want to main a Rogue, but are just not quite convinced? Let me know all of those thoughts in the comments down below, and I'll see all of you guys in another video.